Hello everybody. I am sitting here with Alex O'Connor, and I really appreciate him sitting down with me today. He's known as the Cosmic Skeptic, like everywhere on social media, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, especially. He's gotten very popular over there. He's blown up recently. He first got really noticed for a response to a Jehovah's Witness. Was it a cartoon commercial type deal? Is that what it was?
Yeah, it was. It was a sort of anti-gay propaganda cartoon that they put out for children, which is always fun.
Yeah. And I thought it would be a good idea to sit down and really talk with him about his experiences, growing up with religion, and then, how he sort of progressed through that and started questioning religion, and then where he went from there. So, Alex, could you start off with, when you were a kid growing up and whatnot, what was your experience with religion?
Well, first, thanks for having me on and everything. I really appreciate it. Growing up, the first thing I really remember in terms of religiosity would be the fact that I went to a religious school, because I was quite lucky in the fact that I was born into a family which was moderately religious. My mum at the time was religious. My nan was. My dad was an atheist, but regardless of that, my family, it wasn't really something we talked about or valued too highly. We did go to church on a Sunday. But it was just it was something that you just did, it wasn't something we really thought about, or I really thought about at least. It's just something I did every Sunday. It was really in school, and of course in church, but in school is the main place where it really started to get into my head, because like church, like I say, it was just something you did. You didn't really take it in too much. But at school, you kind of, that's, you should be sort of taking everything in at school. So when we had RE lessons, everything was taught from a Catholic perspective. I never learned anything about any other religions other than Catholicism, and I was taught it as fact. And that's sort of the first thing I remember. And I remember that for the longest time, I didn't really question it or anything. It was just sort of something I accepted as fact. God existed. God created the world. I didn't know anything about science. I wasn't interested in science really at the time. And so, at least in the beginning, definitely just Catholicism sort of pushed onto me mainly by my school.
So, what was the, like you say that your school really pushed it onto you. So, I guess you had religious studies class. Did they try to push religion in other classes in school?
Well, there's the whole, before every assembly you will say a prayer. Before meals you say, it's difficult to remember exactly when it was, but all times, there was always some kind of way to connect what we were doing with religion. So whether it be before a test or something, or before we ate, or before we went and did something particular, we could say a prayer. And I don't know, because we did we did have science classes. I don't remember them very well, but I can only wonder if it had an effect. If it had an effect on our science classrooms. And of course, my sort of age range's first experience of sex education, that was in primary school, of course. And it's difficult to remember, and it's a shame, because I'd quite like to sort of know, quite like to remember sort of how much religion would have affected that, because it's something I sort of really care about, is when religion starts affecting other areas of study. It's something that I really want to try and eliminate. And so I wish I could remember really just how much it sort of influenced the rest of my schooling. But I would say I was quite lucky, and it was relatively subtle and relatively easy to escape as well.
I guess the next question would be, at what point did you start really questioning, religion, school or in your childhood?
Well, it was, it's difficult to say, because it's not something that I really thought about too much. It was very gradual for me. It certainly wasn't like one day I just woke up and realized there was no God and had some kind of revelation. It was very, very gradual. And I think it probably started as soon as I started doing sort of independent research into the world, because our education system here in the UK is quite ethnocentric. We only really learnt about British history, British culture, British religion. And so it was only through sort of recreationally reading books and watching YouTube videos, really, that I started to see the world for what it was, this place of sort of untold joy and happiness and wonder, but also this place of untold misery and suffering. And that started to get me to question things, because, you know, it was really playing on my mind. Why does God love me but not love the kids who are dying in Africa? You know, as a kid, that's sort of the question. And I've now sort of realized that this isn't really something that I like to bring up in debates, because it's really easily defensible from a theological standpoint. So I was trying to steer clear from it, but I do think it's really popular in terms of people's first questioning of faith, even if they later sort of explain it to themselves. By then it's been replaced by better arguments. But yeah, I'd say that that's sort of when it started, and that must have been nearing the end of primary school, before I went into secondary school. I just started sort of noticing these things. And then there's everyday suffering, not just worldwide, but in terms of, you know, people dying, innocent people dying, or anything like that, you know, crime, people being victims of natural disasters or of moral evils or whatever it might be, sort of got me questioning. Even if they're not now arguments which I would rely on, that's probably how it started, yeah.
Were you like vocal about it with anybody really, or did you kind of keep it to yourself, like your questioning?
Well, it was, I wouldn't say I challenged anybody on it, but I was definitely intrigued. So I would speak to mainly my teachers in religious education lessons, education, quote unquote. Certainly remember sort of asking a lot of questions. Nowadays, when we have discussions about religion in like philosophy classes or whatever, I'm much more sort of it's in a more sort of challenging nature. So I'll sort of take what's being said and I'll critique it and look at sort of other viewpoints. But back then it was genuinely just interest. It was, you know, there must be some kind of answer. This is my teachers, and God definitely exists, so there has to be some kind of explanation. So I'd go to the teacher and say, you know, Miss, why is there all this suffering in the world? Well, I don't know. God works in mysterious ways. You ask your priest, you know, why is there suffering in the world? Why do innocent people die? You know, oh well, we can never know the mind of God. Coming from, you know, the same people who were telling me certain rules and doctrinal facts, which were, you know, they were so certain of, to then say, well, actually, no, we don't understand sort of what God wants or what it's like, it started to really mess with my mind. And then you turn to other explanations, because the next logical step for me of in that time was to just, I think it was Ask Jeeves back then that I was using. You know, looking at sort of God and looking at why these things might be happening. And I suddenly realized it was like opening the floodgates to all of these other worldviews that I didn't even know existed. One of which happened to be secularist or atheistic sort of worldviews. I try to refrain from saying an atheistic worldview. But when I say an atheistic worldview, I mean any worldview which doesn't involve deity generally. And that blew my mind, you know, the thought that there are people who don't believe in God. That doesn't make any sense. But yeah, it was after I did that, I started to realize that there are much more rational explanations from sort of different worldviews than Christianity, and they were much more sure of themselves. I was getting fed up of nobody being able to answer my questions, and so when I found people who could, I started thinking maybe you know, what they're teaching is more appropriate to the things that the questions that I want answered.
Well, I'm kind of curious. Like, who did you find that solace in? Like, who did you find those answers like with?
Well, initially, it's difficult to remember. I probably was.
Well, maybe not like specific people, but I guess maybe like a group or whatnot.
Oh, I see. Right. Yeah. So I think the online there is an atheist community online. Atheism isn't a community, but there is an atheist community that exists online, and I would say that people from that community, nobody in particular, but they're very active on like forums, very active on like, you know, places like Yahoo Answers or Reddit or whatever it might be. I'm sure that I probably just came across things like that just from everyday people. People would be asking the questions on these forums saying, you know, why is there evil and suffering in the world, which is what I would have searched. And they probably were in the same position of me. They really didn't know of different worldviews or what the answers might be. And I was still quite young at this point. And I would have just come across people, just everyday people, just saying, well, hey, some people don't believe in God, and from that perspective, this all makes sense, and that's probably what happened. And then, as it went on, as I got older, I started watching YouTube videos and finding, everyone finds Richard Dawkins at some point or another. He was, the first person that really started to make me think, okay, there are people who are not just don't just question God or whatever, but fundamentally do not believe in him. And then from there, you find videos of Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and Hemant Mehta, who's great, and you find the smaller YouTubers, and then you decide to read the books, and as it goes on, I couldn't tell you what point it happened. I was probably just sat there reading a book, possibly The God Delusion or God is Not Great or whatever it might have been, and you just read that one little convincing line, and you just think, what, this makes so much sense. And I think that was probably what did it for me, but very, very gradually, just a mixture of different sources, because by that time I'd realized that, if you can't be taught something, I'd been taught by people religion. I've been taught religion by people, but that was sort of by one group of people, just my school. So I realized at that point, that sort of taught me a very important lesson, that unless a worldview or an argument can be backed up by many different people from many different angles and still make sense to you, you probably shouldn't be subscribing to it. And that's what happened to me with the sort of atheist community that I stumbled into.
Okay. I find that a lot of Christians out there on the internet or even face to face, they will think that you just decided to turn your back on God one day because you wanted to sin, and they don't see it as a gradual thing where you're not really examining that. So that's one of the points of these interviews that I do, is to point out the fact that there's a gradual descent into it. So there wasn't like you said that there was at one point where you're like, yeah, this makes sense, but it was a gradual getting to that point.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't like a light switch, but once you got to that point, it was more or less like you took that leap into, I guess you would call it more or less secularism rather than atheism, right?
Yeah, well, I would say that at first I was probably quite guilty of being, I turned into somewhat of a dogmatic atheist. I wasn't particularly vocal about it at that point, but in my own mind, I was sort of convinced by these intellectuals that there was no God, and I was probably very much in my head, very arrogant about it. And it was only sort of after I'd been doing that for a while that I took a step back and thought, well, you know what, let's be fair about this. I wanted to start talking about it. I wanted to start debating people and having conversations, but I realized that when people would say certain things, I wouldn't always know what to say. And it struck me that I hadn't really properly considered some of the more sophisticated arguments for any particular religion, because back when I was an actual Christian, I was only hearing the sort of fundamental arguments. So I took a while to sort of look into other people's points of view, reading the Bible, reading books by religious authors, watching videos by religious people, and trying to understand where they're coming from and trying to point out the flaws and critique their arguments. And yeah, it was that was, and then I realized that when I wanted to talk about these things, it started as a philosophical endeavor. It started off as I'm interested in the existence of God, let's talk about it. And then it became sort of an activist kind of thing. I saw that the effect of religion on education and politics was beginning to become incredibly detrimental. And that's when I realized that it's more important for me at the moment in terms of what I want to do. I'm more interested now in getting people to stop using their religious beliefs as excuses for infringing upon other people's rights than I am about convincing people of an atheistic worldview. So that's when I realized that, I switched to secularism being my main focus, which was very recently, actually. Very, very recently. Pretty much when I started making YouTube videos is when I realized, hang on, I've got something more important here than just sort of making funny videos about why God probably isn't real. I want to, talk about why secularism is the way forward, especially in the areas of politics and education. That's kind of, so I'd say that's at the moment you're right. Yeah, that's probably my main thing at the moment is political and educational secularism. That's what I'm sort of aiming to convince people is not only viable but necessary.
Okay. We'll get to the politics and whatnot here in a second, but what the next thing that I want to kind of ask you about, and this might be a little bit of a hard question, is I'm wondering if you can compare yourself, like after you drop the God belief to when you still believed in God. Like, is there a difference in your core like personality or person, like between
Yeah,
those two phases of your life?
I would say I'm certainly more inquisitive. Now, okay, so I'm a different person, but I don't know if it's necessarily directly due to the fact that I'm now an atheist. I think, though, that the process of me becoming an atheist taught me a lot of things, particularly that everything is open to question, that you should always be willing to change your mind if sufficient evidence is offered. And I'd say that, I don't think I've changed much as a person. And I think this is one of the crazy things when you see these videos of people coming out as atheists to their parents, and their parents go wild and they want to kick them out of the house because all of a sudden, like, they're a completely different person. But they've been an atheist for the past, however long it's been before they felt ready to tell you, and you hadn't even noticed. So it's really not that big of a deal. And I'd say, yeah, I didn't change much. I possibly became more open. Because once I realized that my religious beliefs were open to question, I realized so are my politics, so is my understanding of everything, really. And at any time that I find myself being taught something new, even today, I sort of think back to a time when I was being taught things as fact, and I didn't question it, and I've now pretty much come to regret it, of course. So any time that I'm taught something now, I'm always ready to question it, not necessarily in a particularly sort of arrogant or confrontational manner, but certainly I learned that questioning things is the most important thing for intellectual development, in my opinion, at least.
Okay. I'm kind of curious, like, have you had any kind of negative reactions from anybody in your life, like after you became more vocal about your non-belief or promoting secularism?
I would say I'm quite lucky in that respect, that there's nothing particularly bad has come of my decision to be vocal about atheism. The only thing really, I suppose, is I wonder if, especially people who who were my teachers and some of my friends and extended family perhaps, may look at me differently but not let me know because they're too polite. It's very possible. I have no idea. So I try not to let it worry me because I just don't know. But I'd say the main thing would be, most people are completely fine with me talking about atheism and trying to sort of argue that there is no God, but specific issues can be somewhat controversial, or some people would say, I'm pushing it a bit, or whatever it might be. And then sometimes, friends or family members or whoever it might be might sort of say, I get what you're doing and I disagree with you with this, and sometimes they might even be a bit upset about it. But generally speaking, they're my friends and they're my family, so we can just sort of talk it out and hopefully we can understand each other's views a bit better. But yeah, I always feel bad for saying it because I really didn't suffer that much negativity at all, not significantly at least, compared to what is out there in the world. So people say all the time that it's incredibly brave of people to come out as an atheist, which in many circumstances it absolutely is. But for me, it wasn't really anything that I needed to muster up. It was just something that happened, and everyone was sort of like, okay, fair enough.
Well, I'm glad that you didn't have to, go through anything. Honestly, I wish that most of the U.S. was like that, but sadly enough, it's not.
Yeah, no.
We definitely have a lot of work to go to normalize atheism. So, advice for a young atheist that's questioning.
Yes, I was going to say, bear in mind that everything is open to question, and that includes your fundamental religious principles, political principles, scientific principles. Okay, so if somebody comes up with the problem of evil and they say, but that doesn't make any sense because God is real, remember that part of the equation that God is real is also open to question. And people say, well, no, God must be real because there's design in the universe. That's open to question. But design must be present in the universe because the universe is perfect and works in complete tandem. That's open to question. Every single thing is open to question. And until you've gone through and sufficiently looked at arguments for either side of these questions, it's difficult to feel satisfied in your worldview. And I'm certainly not satisfied fully in my worldview across the board in terms of politics, religion, and science, because there's so many questions that I'm still left to answer for myself. Things that I'm left to study. I'm sure there's so many religious texts, political texts, and things that I haven't read, videos I haven't watched, and people I haven't met. But I'm willing to say that at the moment, at least, I'm completely unconvinced by theology. And this is an important point. Like, if you're beginning to question your faith, remember that atheism is not an active standpoint. You could consider it as taking a break. Don't think, this is terrible because if I give up God, I'm going to hell. I run the risk of eternal damnation. Okay, well, just think of it as taking a break. Think, okay, well, let's look at this from an unbiased standpoint. Let's go on the assumption I no longer believe in God for the next 2 hours. Then watch some videos, read some books, reconsider your position, and then by the end of it, you might be like, well, actually, okay, I still believe in God. Great, you've looked at it from an unbiased perspective, and you can more convincingly assert that you believe in God. But until you've done that, it's difficult, and you're going to end up questioning a lot of things. So if you do begin questioning things, don't be afraid to just take a break. You can always, God's always going to be there. You can come back next week. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Just take a bit of time out. Take a bit of time to look at other people's arguments. Don't, instantly condemn them. It's very easy. We do it with Ken Ham and Ray Comfort. They do it with Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. Let's try not to do that. Just question things for yourself, and do not listen to anything that anybody else is saying, and don't take it as gospel. Okay, consider their viewpoints, but look for the fallacies, look for the problems in their arguments, in their positions, see if it makes sense to you, and whatever makes sense to you, just go with it. Don't be afraid to go with it, because if your understanding is wrong, then you can only blame God for not having given you the correct resources to discover Him more convincingly. You can't possibly expect somebody to believe in you as a God if you are not providing them with sufficient conviction. If you are creating this person with the ability to criticize theology, and then you're also presenting this person criticisms of theology, you can't expect that person to believe in you. Sorry, God, doesn't work like that.
Yeah. Which for anybody out there that is really interested in that whole kind of experiment of, taking a little while to not believe in God, there's a very interesting case in that. It's Ryan Bell. I don't know if you've heard of that person there, Alex, but he actually did like a whole year without God. And just forewarning, though, he came out the other side as an atheist. But he did a full year without God. He did a blog on it where he recorded his whole year without God, and I've actually got an interview with him on my channel about it. So if you're at all interested in that, definitely check out Ryan's blog and his interview, and if you're interested in that at all. And then finally, I want to know, like, where do you see yourself going with, your channel or, your atheism? Like, is this like kind of like a hobby thing? Do you plan on it turning into more of an activist type deal, or what do you plan on doing?
Well, it's a big question. I think I'm certainly planning for, certainly at the moment, I'd like to think that for the rest of my life, I'll be arguing my case for secularism. If I ever did become an activist of any kind, probably wouldn't be an activist for atheism. I'd probably be more of an activist for secularism. I might look at it from an atheistic standpoint, and philosophically speaking, I might do debates with people where I try and convince them of atheism. But in terms of politics, education, and my general mission, I suppose, would not be atheism. That would be the hobby side of things. The mission would be secularism. I'd like to think that the channel, I think of my YouTube channel as a it's an outlet. It's not me collectively. I would like to think that I have ideas, I have things I want to do, and YouTube is one way of doing that. But so is writing a book, so is public speaking, so is doing interviews on other people's channels, whatever it might be. So yeah, I'd like to continue the YouTube channel, but I'd also like to expand and do anything I can to sort of help people understand my worldview and the worldview of people who agree with me, because I think that the more we understand each other, the more we're going to be able to accept each other, regardless of our religious, political, or scientific beliefs.
No, I think that's awesome, and I think that secularism and science, should be the focus.
Absolutely.
For me personally, here in America at least, like my focus is like the normalizing of atheism or non-belief, but it's also secularism, which for me is kind of tied to atheism right now because of the fact that it atheism is kind of like a subset of secularism.
Yeah, and I would agree with you there that it's not about necessarily advocacy for atheism, but it was a good point about the normalization of atheism, rather. Not necessarily saying you should all be atheists, but saying that if you want to be an atheist, that's cool. Don't worry about it. I think that's a really good point there.
Yeah, it was awesome to have you, as an interview guest here, Alex. And we did get a little bit off topic, there in the middle. But I really appreciate you coming on here.
No, it's good fun. It's good fun.
Yeah. Now, if everybody wants to go and subscribe to Alex's channel, definitely do that. He puts out some pretty awesome content. He mainly focuses on responding to religious or scientific stuff, it's a lot of some similar stuff that I respond to. Not all the same stuff, but we have responded to some of the same videos. But he does provide a different perspective than I do. A lot less cursing. But me, I'm from Alabama in the U.S., and so that's the South. I grew up around cursing, so it's taken a little bit for me to actually work that out of my vocabulary. But anyways, definitely.
I'm Oxfordian, so it's not really something that comes into my vocabulary. Never really sort of brought up in that way. I'm polite and I sit and drink tea.
Well, again, everybody go subscribe to Alex here. Alex, you wanna tell everybody anything else about you?
Well, I suppose, feel free to check out my channel. Everything is Cosmic Skeptic. I got lucky. Everything was nothing was taken. So, any social media or YouTube is all sort of /Cosmic Skeptic. Let me know if people are watching the video on your channel. If you sort of have any other questions or things that people are interested in, anybody watching, if you leave a comment on this video, I'll try and sort of go through and maybe answer some of the questions that people have. I think that would be a good place to do it. I'm not sure sort of how many or how much I'll answer, but I'll try and answer questions if people leave them in the comments of this video. But let me know what you think of my worldview and ask me questions and challenge me, and I'm always open to conversation. So feel free to sort of shoot me a message or check out my videos and let me know what you think, and hopefully we can sort of start some more discussions.
Awesome. I really appreciate it, Alex, and I hope you have a nice night. I'm going to have a great afternoon, considering there's about a 6-hour time difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I'll let you go, and
great, awesome.
I hope everybody has a nice night, and I'll see you guys later.
Yeah, have a good afternoon. See you later. Bye, guys.